Welcome to our last podcast on the Constitution. In this podcast, we will be looking at changing the Constitution and understanding the Constitution. As we look at changing the Constitution, the learning objective is as follows. Explain how the Constitution can be formally amended and how it changes informally. For understanding the Constitution, our learning objective is assess whether the Constitution establishes a majoritarian democracy and how it limits the scope of government. As you listen to this podcast, think about these questions. How might you change the Constitution? What amendments would you change or take out? Are there any amendments you feel need to be added to the Constitution? Let's begin. The Constitution can be formally amended, and it changes informally. Constitutional changes may occur either by formal amendments or by a number of informal processes. Let's look first at the formal amending process. The formal amendments change the written language of the Constitution. There are two stages to the amendment process: proposal and ratification, each with two alternative routes. All the amendments to the Constitution have been proposed by Congress. No constitutional convention has been convened since the original Constitutional Convention. All except one of the successful amendments have been ratified by state legislatures. Formal amendments have made the Constitution more egalitarian and democratic. The emphasis on economic issues in the original document is now balanced by amendments that stress equality and increase the ability of a popular majority to affect government. The most important effect has been to expand liberty and equality in America. Some amendments have been proposed, but not ratified, and the best known of these in recent years is the Equal Rights Amendment. Review this slide and be prepared to explain how the Constitution can be amended. Remember, there are two ways to propose an amendment and two ways for an amendment to be ratified. Remember, one of the four combinations has been used in every case but one. Now that we've gone over the formal process of amending the Constitution, let's look at the informal process of constitutional change. First, judicial interpretation. Judicial interpretation can profoundly affect how the Constitution is understood. In 1803, the famous case of Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court decided it would be the one to resolve differences of opinion when it claimed for itself the power of judicial review. Remember, judicial review is the power to decide whether the actions of the legislative and executive branches of state and national government are in accord with the Constitution. Changing political practice. Changing political practice can also change the meaning of the Constitution. The development of political parties dramatically changed the form of American government. Changing political practice has altered the role of the Electoral College, which today is often seen as the rubber stamp in selecting the president. Technology. Yes, I said technology. The Constitution has been greatly changed by technology. The mass media plays a role unimaginable in the 18th century. The bureaucracy has grown in importance with the advent of technological developments such as computers. Electronic communications and the development of atomic weapons have enhanced the President's role as Commander-in-Chief. The last way to change the Constitution informally is increasing demands on policymakers. The power of the presidency has grown as a result of increased demands for new policies. The United States' growth to a status of a superpower in international affairs has located additional power in the hands of the chief executive. National security concerns tend to result in more power to the president, although Congress tends to reassert itself eventually. Increased demands of domestic policy have placed the president in a more prominent role in preparing the federal budget and proposing a legislative program. What amendment goes with this picture? Let's look now at the importance of flexibility. The United States has the oldest functioning constitution in existence today. The framers of the Constitution created a flexible system of government that could adapt to the needs of the times without sacrificing personal freedom. Even with 27 amendments, the Constitution is a very short document because it does not prescribe the structure and the functioning of the national government in detail. Now let's turn and look at the last concept for today, understanding the Constitution. The Constitution and democracy. Democratic government was despised and feared among 18th century upper-class society. The Constitution created a republic, a representative form of democracy modeled after the Lockean tradition of limited government. One of the central themes of American history is the gradual democratization of the Constitution, away from the elitist model of democracy and towards a pluralist one. Today, few people share the founders' fear of democracy, the Constitution, and the scope of government. Separation of powers and checks and balances allow almost all groups some place in the political system where their demands for public policy can be heard. Separation of powers and checks and balances also promote the politics of bargaining, compromise, playing one institution against another, and an increase in hyper-pluralism. Some scholars suggest that so much checking was built into the American political system that effective government is almost impossible due to gridlock. Please understand, gridlock is a good thing. We will look at gridlock more closely when we are looking at Congress in our unit on the institutions of government. The outcome may be non-decisive when hard decisions are needed. That concludes this podcast on the Constitution. Remember, in this podcast, we looked at changing the Constitution and understanding the Constitution. The learning objectives are as follows. Explain how the Constitution can be formally amended and how it changes informally. Assess whether the Constitution establishes a majoritarian democracy and how it limits the scope of government. Thank you for joining in on our last podcast on the Constitution. Our next two podcasts will be dealing with the concept of federalism. It will be broken down into two specific podcasts. The first podcast on federalism will be defining federalism and the constitutional basis of federalism. The second podcast on federalism will deal with intergovernmental relations today and understanding federalism.